Well, first of all, I would like to say what I shall not be concerned with, because it is an extremely complex narrative in which Herodotus reworks a highly stratified tradition. But I will not deal with the possible Near Eastern origins of this narrative, and I will not deal with the Greek antecedents, in particular the problem of the origins of tyranny as developed by early Greek poetry, especially Solon and Theognis. Instead, I shall try to say something on a number of features of Herodotus' account of the rise of Deioces and of the political theory underlying the narrative. And also, second point, on the broader intellectual context in which Herodotus' ideas can be situated. And I'll be selective on this point too, because let me say at the beginning that I will not deal with, I will not include in the discussion the anonymous Iamblichi, so the Greek author excerpted by Iamblichus in chapters 20 of his Protecticus, because that would need a separate talk on the one side. On the other side, there are very good, quite recent discussions by Manuel Amari in her commentary of the anonymous Iamblichus, and also in the recent commentary written by Anders Sorensen. Okay, so let's consider briefly these chapters. I will try to focus on, here we are. So Deiocles' trajectory unfolds in two phases. First, a rise to power, and then the transformation of this power into an absolute monarchy. The Medes leaves Catacomas. By the way, the translation is the translation by Godley, which I use because it's easily available online. So the Medes leaves Catacomas by village and in a state of widespread lawlessness. Anomia is a key word here. Deioces the Mede, a sophos, having a strong desire of power, of tyranny, erastes tyrannidos, I will go back to this words, engages in the practice of justice. For this reason, he is chosen as judge in his village. So this is the first step. Then, as the news of his righteousness spreads, the Medes flock to him from every village in the country. So a wider range of his influence. He thus became the only, munos is another key word, and increasingly sought after judge in the entire country, in effect bringing a first centralization of the Medes by judicial means. Having thereby gained an overall control of the situation, Herodotus says that he realizes that es auton pan anakeimenos, it is all up to him, so he is somehow indispensable. Deioces abruptly interrupts his activity, declaring that he can no longer continue to neglect his own personal interest to do justice to others. This refusal produces a condition of disorder and lawlessness, once again anomia, even worse than before, and prompts the Medes to gather in an assembly and to decide they need a monarch. So here we have a sort of first short constitutional debate in the histories. Deioces is proposed and chosen as king with universal praise. The second phase thus begins, in which Deioces undertakes a process of consolidation of his position that leads to both centralization and construction of a superior power. First, he gets the means to build him a palace worthy of kingship, Axiates Basileies, the location of which he himself indicates, as well as to strengthen his position by means of bodyguards chosen by himself. Having thus firmly obtained power, Deioces enforces the construction of a single city, hen polisma. This is also a very relevant. These are very relevant words to which all Medes must refer. The capital, Ecbatana, is fortified with 7 circles of walls marked by battlements of different colors. This further stage in the process of unification and centralization imposed by Deioces on the countries is what the Greeks would have called a synecism. There is, however, an essential difference. A Greek synecism, a synokismos, implies a concentration, either residential or even only administrative, like in Athens, to facilitate political meeting, assembling, whereas Deioces' operation, on the contrary, creates a separation, a distance. Deioces is in fact making himself inaccessible and hidden from the sight of most by creating a complex ceremonial, a cosmos, in order to confer to his person a different status. So he wants to appear heteroios, as Herodotus says, of a different nature. Further strengthened by this disposition, Deioces again becomes a strict guardian of the just. So we have todikaion phulasson chalipos, harsh, strict. And so the theme of justice reappears, albeit in different terms, in the final part of the narrative, creating a sort of circular structures. I may go back to this point later, a kind of ring composition. The result of all this is also the unification of the people of the Medes, as well as the solid 53 years reign that is eventually handed over to Deioces' son. So there is a unification, there is a centralization, is in a sense the creation of a state together with the creation of a monarchy. Now, let's focus on the first part, on the rise of Deioces. This rise is articulated in 3 main stages, 3 main steps, each characterized and linked by a sequence of corresponding metaphors that present the evolution of Deioces' relationship with power as that of an initially private erotic desire, ultimately crowned by public consent. Indeed, central to the whole trajectory of Deioces, is the dialectic between the private and the public. This is a central theme of the whole narrative. The 3 stages are an individual desire for power, a brilliant strategy to achieve it, and the final attainment of the desired goal. In the first stage, here you have the summary. Deioces is described as desiring tyranny, erastes tyrannitos. In the second, he begins to court power, monomenos archen, and finally he received the consent of the Medes to become their ruler through an agreement which, I shall try to argue, has a matrimonial character. So tuton cateneusi basilea sphici einai. In developing these metaphors, Herodotus deliberately changed both the verb, erastes, monomenos, perhaps kataineusi, we will discuss this point later, and its object. So first tyrannies, then the more general arche, eventually basilea, referred to David Basileus. With regard to the first stage, the desire of tyrannies, this is expressed in terms belonging to the lexical family of heros, hermai, and is attested elsewhere in Herodotus elsewhere. does, sorry. So, for example, in 353-4, Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, attempting to persuade his son to return to Corinth, reminds him that tyranny is a precarious possession and that many are in love with it. So, polloi deotes herastai eisim. Likewise, in 532, Pausanias is reported, even if Herodotus does not appear to believe it, is reported to have conceived a passionate desire to become tyrant of Greece. But the main difference between these passages and our passage about Deicoes is that the language in these passages refers only to the aspiration, to a desire, while in the case of Deicoes, the desire is successfully realized through a complex political strategy. So Herodotus' new element, if I can say, lies not in the metaphor itself, which was already traditional, by the way we find also in Aristophanes, for example, but in its development. So as so often in Herodotus, the originality lies in the elaboration of a traditional element, which is extended, amplified in a kind of climax, in a kind of Steigerung. So this metaphor has been studied by various scholars, said Bernadette, François Artaud, and there is also an interesting book by Victoria Wall, Love Among the Ruins, which devotes some pages on that. And Bernadette observed that Herodotus uses eros only in two senses, sexual desire and the desire for tyranny. Now, the story of Deioces, like other Herodotean narratives, illustrate the overlap between the two spheres. And in this respect, a parallel sometimes invoked is that of Deicoes, who effectively chooses both Candaules' wife and his kingdom. The story of Deicoes leads us to the early attestation, to the early instance of this image, so the desire for a tyrannus, as well as to the word tyrannus itself. Herodotus alludes to this when, after recounting the outcome of the story of Deicoes and Candaules, he remarks that Deicoes is mentioned by Archilochus in the fragment 19 West that you have on the handout. Some scholars have proposed that the reference to Archilochus is a later interpolation, although, in my view, arguments advanced in support of this hypothesis are not convincing, and I'm happy to see that also. Karen Diwan and Rosario Manson don't share the idea of a later interpolation, and also Tiesson in his great book on Herodotus and poetry. I think that Andrea Rothstein, in his book on Jambus, has said, should be said on the topic. So the allusion of Herodotus is to the famous verses in which a speaker, identified by Aristotle as the carpenter Charon, declares, among other things, that he does not desire great tyrannus, great power, megale sucereo tyrannidos. Herodotus was therefore familiar to these well-known verses of Archilochus. One may even wonder whether they lie in the background of Herodotus, of this detail of Herodotus' narrative itself. The same verses, anyway, were used by the sophist Hippias in a discussion concerning the vocabulary of personal rule, a topic that also lies at the heart of the present Herodotean passage. In other words, even if there are no compelling grounds for supposing that Herodotus consciously evokes Archilochus, especially since the same image or imagery appears elsewhere in his work, yet Herodotus knew and explicitly quoted these verses, which had already become part of a broader discussion concerning both the terminology and the history of tyranny, and probably also about the discussion between the difference of Tyrannus and Basileus. Now, for the second stage, let's move from Erastes to the Nidos to Mnomenos Archen. Herodotus employs monomai in the sense of to court, to woo. The verb occurs twice elsewhere in Herodotus, and in one instance with the same metaphorical use. Cyrus ostensibly seeks Tomiri's hand, so the queen of the Massagete, while in reality pursuing her kingdom. The object is now expressed through the more general term arche rather than tyrannies. Now I move to the more interesting and perhaps subtle element that I would like to discuss with you. Herodotus writes, and this is what happens immediately after the assembly of the Medes, that I read the Greek, autica de proballomenon ontinas teson tai Basilea, o Deioces en olos hypopantos andron kai proballomenos kai aineomenos, eso tuton kai teneusi Basileans phisi einai. Now here, kataineo simply means, may simply mean to consent, as it is generally understood, beginning with Powell's lexicon. And I think that Powell is always right. And even if he's wrong, I've no, he has good reason for being wrong. So it's always worth considering carefully what he says. Yet, there may be more at stake. These lines, the one I just read, are very carefully constructed. Let me quote the commentary, the excellent commentary by Karin de Wald and Rosario Manson. They stress that the first participle is middle, proballomenon, while the two others are passive, proballomenos kai aineomenos. The play between active and passive again underline the paradoxical undercurrent of the whole passage, they note. Although acting on their own interest, the Medes choose to hand over their freedom to a monarch. Now, that's the end of quotation. The idea of Deioces or Deicoes choice as a ruler has already been introduced through the participle proballomenos kai aineomenos, proposed and praised by everyone. And we also have the verbal play between aineomenos and kataineusi, which I think serves to highlight the latter term and to stress the relevance of this word. Now, kataineo can also mean promise to marriage. And you have a passage of Euripides with this meaning, with kataineo with this meaning. In the light of the immediately preceding metaphorical use of hermai and monomai, it may be suggested that Herodotus conclude the metaphors of erotic desire and courtship with the image of Deioces himself finally being given in marriage as king to the Medes. Now, there are some grammatical, let's say, difficulties. The einai at the end, I have a proposal about this, but I prefer to go on, to continue. What is beyond doubt, and what I would like to stress, is that the crucial element is the consent of the Medes, who are themselves not fully aware of the political process unfolding before them. By the way, Joshua Hober wrote some interesting pages on this point. The highly elaborate structure of the passage, together with the two preceding stages of erotic desire and courtship, suggests to me that Herodotus may be evoking the image of an eventually matrimonial fulfillment. If this reading is correct, we move from a relatively common metaphor, erastes tyrannidos, to a less common one, monomenos archen, and finally to a rarer, decidedly rarer image, this use of kataineosi. We shall encounter a further element later on that may lend support to this interpretation. But I would like to stress one point now. The choice of the Medes to have a monarch is presented as entirely consensual. And it is therefore no coincidence that only at this stage, so when Herodotus speaks about the assembly of the Medes and the subsequent decision of setting up a monarch and the choice of the subsequent choice of Deicoes, that only at this stage the terms Basileus enter the narrative, and the lexical family of Basileus dominates the ensuing lines, so the subsequent lines, in which Herodotus describes the transformation of the power thus acquired by Deicoes in an absolute monarchy. Now, 2 points. The first is the connection with the idea of consent with the term Basileus. This issue occupies a central place in 5th and 4th century discussion on the possibility of distinguishing Basileia from tyrannies, kingship and tyranny. One naturally recalls the famous passage of Thucydides' Archaeology, where discussing the rise of tyrannies and their difference from earlier hereditary monarchies, Thucydides writes, tyrannies were established in most cities. Previously, there had been a hereditary kingship with fixed prerogatives. So a retois geos, and retois implies an agreement between the Basileus and the demos he rules. Whatever historical value one assigns to Thucydides' testimony concerning kingship in archaic Greek cities, the passage provides evidence for a broader intellectual debate in 5th century concerning the relationship between tyranny and kingship, where consent or lack of consent on the part of the government, on the ruled, marks a dividing line, and also more generally a discussion about the vocabulary and the varieties of personal rule. Traces of the discussion can be seen in the passage of Hippias quoted above, and also the Herodotean narrative of Deioces offers evidence for this. Evidence in a narrative, but there is an underlying theory. Now, the second issue I would like to deal with concerns the image of a union, of a kind of marriage between Deioces of Basileus and the Medes. Thinking about this, I was reminded of the closing scene of Aristophanes' Bird, a play performed in 414, where Pisetairos is united in marriage with Basileia. I would like to conclude this talk with some remarks about the relationship between Herodotus' narrative about Deioces and Aristophanes' Birds. There is an unanimous agreement among scholars about the presence of Herodotus in Aristophanes' Birds. And scholarly attention has been primarily focused on those passages concerning the construction of the great wall in the middle of the air by the birds. Pisetairos explicitly compares these structures to the walls of Babylon. So already at line 552, the bird's wall is said to be built of plinthoi hoptai, baked bricks, a detail prominently featured in Herodotus' description of Babylon. In the extended account of the wall building, beginning at verse 1124, Herodotan Deicoes become even more numerous. Both Dunbar, in her commentary on words, and Nesselrod, in her quite recent articles on Herodotus and Aristophanes, have emphasized that the Herodotean resonances in this part of the comedy are remarkably abundant and cannot be reduced to the famous description of Babylon. So this is important to stress, because sometimes there is a sentence of focusing on a single passage and of looking for a close intertextual relationship, the relationship between verses of Aristophanes and one single passage of Herodotus. I think this is somehow a way of looking at literature, let's say, through the keyhole. It would be better to try and gain a wider perspective. And I think in the case of birds, this is quite clear. And by the way, once again, I agree with the cautious approach in the commentary of Karin de Wald and Rosaria Manson on this point, the commentary about in the passages about Herodotus' description of Babylon and the possible relationship with Aristophanes' birth. So both Dunbar and Nesselrod have emphasized that the Herodotean resonances in this part of the comedy are remarkably abundant and cannot be reduced to the famous description of Babylon alone. Rather, they include allusion to the Egyptian logos, especially those passages dealing with the construction of Egyptian monuments, as well as stylistic and thematic feature characteristic of the Herodotean narrative more generally. Other passages have also been proposed, for example, including a connection with the construction of the long walls at Athens. But I would like to suggest an additional element of comparison: the story of Deioces, and more specifically, a parallel between the overall trajectory of Deicoes and that of Pesetairos. One may describe the births, Aristophanes' births, as the story of the rise to power of a private individual who, with the cooperation of an entire community actually reshaped by him, the birds, ultimately establishes authority over that very community. By the end of the play, Pesetairos has become a kind of universal tyrant, exercising dominion over men, gods, and birds alike. Even at that general level, the affinity with the story of Deioces is evident. In both cases, albeit in different literary genres, the central theme is the rise of a single individual to absolute power. So I would like to enlarge the comparison, not to be too much focused just on the construction of the walls of the birds, of the city of the birds. Several aspects of this rise are common to both narratives, both in Herodotus and in Aristophanes. A full demonstration would require much time and a detailed analysis. Here I will highlight a few particularly significant points. First, the construction of a single city, Polisma, Mia Polis, has a central position in both narratives. Secondly, the theme, the motive of the walls is important for Ektabana, and for Babylon, as well as for the city of the birds. I say this because I have some difficulties in pronouncing the English version of Nephelipotia. Thirdly, the construction of a single city of the capital serves to unify the population of birds and to create a common political identity and to shape a common political identity, as much as Deioces, foundation of a royal center, contributes to unification of the Medes. Also, in both in the comedy and in the Herodotan passage of Deicoes, we have a very careful choice of the vocabulary about ruling alone. Finally, Piseteros, who initially appears to seek the restoration of the kingship of the birds, of the basileia of the birds, ultimately appropriates power for himself and becomes a tyrant. So the same tension between kingship and tyranny, and the use of power made by Deioces characterize the Herodotean narrative. Now let me focus on two main aspects: the construction of the cities, presented to the birds as the means by which they will recover their lost kingship, and secondly, the final marriage between Piseteros and Basileia, through which Piseteros secures that very kingship for himself. Now, at the beginning of the comedy, Piseteros is searching for a city, and seeks advice from Tereus, the hoopoe. Suddenly, however, he conceives a new idea. He says, "I see in the race of bird a great plan and a mighty power, if only you would be persuaded by me." And what's this idea? What's the proposal? Oikesate mian polin, so establish a single city. Piseteros present the project as a synergism of all birds, and at the same time as the capital of the universal empire, destined to rule over gods and men alike. After all the birds have been summoned and their initial suspicion overcome, Piseteros persuades them to support the scheme on the ground that he will restore their ancestral kingship. These are the verses 550, 552. So first of all, he says, so he renews the proposal previously outlined to Tereus, and he says, first of all, I propose that there should be a single city of the birds. Then you should encircle the entire air and all the space in between with a great wall of baked bricks like Babylon. And Ewelpides replies, "What a formidable polisma." Sometimes translate fortress city, but I think it's important to stress this word, pay attention to this word, polisma. So the fortified city becomes the instrument through which power is to be recovered from Zeus and exercised by the birds over gods and men. Ostensibly, this power is to belong to the birds. In reality, it becomes the basis for Piseteros' own domination. Two features deserves particular emphasis. First, the repeated insistence on the notion of a single city. So Piseteros insists on this point, one single city for all the birds in the two instances in which he proposes his plan. Then, secondly, the use of the word polisma. This word is used only twice in Aristophanes. Well, of course, we lost a lot of Aristophanes, but it's interesting that we find this word only here in the birds. So Piseteros says we have to find mian polin, and then Piseteros change the word poly with polisma, and eventually when Poseidon with Heracles and the other Thracian Tribalus comes with an embassy to the birds, to Piseteros, he sees the city and says, "To men polisma tes nephelokopygias oran to di Parestin." So here we have the the cities of Nephelopodias. No? So polisma is the word that defines a city. And it's also not very common in Herodotus. It's mainly used for non-Greek or pre-Greek cities. And it's used both for Babylon and for Ecbatana. But the relevant thing is that Ecbatana is a relevant example because it's the single city that Deicoes built in order to unify and give a new identity to all the myths. So I think that this is a relevant common feature. So the final marriage with Basileia constitutes another crucial element. I'm going towards the end. Following the advice of Prometheus, Piseteiros secures power for himself through this union. By the conclusion of the play, he has effectively appropriated tyrannical power over the birds through the marriage with Basileia. The nature of this Basileia has generated extensive scholarly debate. I found the conclusion of Douglas McDowell and Carol Attack persuasive. Piseteiros' acquisition of sole authority over the city and ultimately over the cosmos itself is presented through his marriage with Basileia, which is the personification of monarchical rule, even though the political order thereby established resembles tyranny more closely than kingship. And the representation of abstract concept through silent female characters is a well-established feature of old comedy, as well as final marriages. So the marriage between Piseteiros and Basileia is therefore the mechanism through which Piseteiros acquires power and lay the foundation for a monarchy subsequently characterized as tyrannical. Perhaps the comparison between Deioces, the comparison with Deioces may illuminate both narratives. In each case, a union, a kind of marriage, metaphorical, if I'm right, in the case of Deioces, legitimizes the rise of an individual ruler. That rise initially rests upon consent, but in both cases, consent became the starting point for the construction of a fundamentally different form of power, one displaying unmistakably tyrannical feature. So let me say just a last thing in conclusion. The foundation of a single city, the construction of its walls, and the role of both elements in the foundation of kinship appear to be the most direct points of contact between the trajectory of Deioces and Piseteiros. The metaphor of motive of marriage may provide a further link. More broadly, the overall trajectories of these two figures are remarkably similar. Both achieve power behind the backs of the very people to whom they present themselves as benefactors. At the very least, both authors bear witness to a wider intellectual debate within which they can most profitably be situated. Sorry, I abuse of your patience, but thank you for your attention. That's it.